Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and yet again I'm pondering what we might have had if Alfred Hitchcock had turned his hand to a musical film. We might have got a song called Waving Through a Rear Window from dear Harmony Heaven Hansen. And that is a very obscure joke. Not least because it's actually disputed as to whether Alfred Hitchcock was involved in Harmony Heaven. If he was, it unfortunately turns the joke on its head anyway, because it was a 1930 British musical film. However, it does now seem that Alfred Hitchcock was merely very loosely involved in it, and certainly not director. Well, that was an unexpectedly detailed start for what was meant to be a throwaway gag. Let's put all that behind us and move straight on. This week is the second part of that conversation that I had with Mike Shapiro about Twisted, the Untold Story of a Royal Vizier, which came into being in 2013, is a parody musical, and purports to do for the Vizier in the 1992 Disney Aladdin film what Wicked did for the Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz. We discussed last week whether it was doing quite the same thing as Wicked, but this week we're going to be looking at the show for what it actually was, and in particular the book, the songs, and the excellent performances, where there was a lot of craft to be seen across the board. I think as a production it's incredibly accomplished. I think all the performers really know what they're doing, and the songwriting is in places supremely excellent. There are some very clever lyrical and musical flourishes, and it's been put together by a team that clearly knows what it's doing. There's a lot of craft on display, and that's what we're going to be talking about today for the most part in this episode. So, let's get on with it and join that second part of the conversation I had with Mike Shapiro about Twisted, the Untold Story of a Royal Vizier. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Did you watch it in one sitting?
I did. And I think there is a certain amount of fatigue that comes in because of the duration. But let me describe both sides of that equation. So I think I should give praise where praise is due. I think the comedic talent in the production we saw, which I assume is the originating company, I assume StarKid wrote this show, is super. They are exquisite comedic actors.
Yes.
They can adopt tropes and make them funny through exaggeration. The gentleman playing the djinn was... The nature of the djinn here was he was entirely comprised of movie quotes or TV quotes. And I think that was meant as maybe a subtle dig at Robin Williams' tendency to drop in all the movie quotes when he was in the original film.
Could you redefine the word subtle for me there? Because I'm not getting the word subtle at all. I just briefly want to steal your thunder and jump in here. What I liked what they did with the genie was they absolutely showed him up to be, and I quote, the arsehole that he absolutely is. That's what Jafar called him, and I'm afraid I've always agreed with that. When I watched Aladdin, I did not warm to the late Robin Williams' performance, I'm sorry to say. I thought it was just too much. And I really enjoyed the fact that was skewered. So I suppose in that sense, I enjoyed that little bit of parody. Sorry, back to you, Mike.
Okay, can I just say that them's fighting words, and for you to not like Robin Williams' performance is completely unacceptable, and I have to apologize to our listenership for your opinion.
Well, don't get me going on Good Morning Vietnam then. Let's move on.
But I will say is the actor who was playing the genie was great at doing all of those movie references and just shifting personalities. If you accept what his mandate was as a character, his comedic talent was a real joy to watch. And I think every actor in the show was top notch in terms of the comedic chops and the timing and the voices. They're really, really, really a talented crew. And I think where I did enjoy this was from the comedy aspect, less so the storytelling aspect. But when they were doing their shtick, they were so good that it became enjoyable just to watch them embody those characters.
And it went on as this is a good thing, it went on at a fair lick. It's one of those scripts, because I think, or indeed I think we both think, that it's a little bit empty. It relies on the humour and the comedy, which, as you say, those performers had in spades, and they went at a really fast pace. So everything was bang, 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 joke, joke, fast, fast, reaction, reaction. And that was really useful for seemingly creating a whole, because I'm just going to once again step aside briefly. Sorry to steal your comments once again, Mike, but I also watched a different version of Twisted that was an amateur version. So no criticism to those actors, the amateurs, but they were taking it at a much slower pace, a really quite remarkably much slower pace, I thought. And what therefore happened was that the whip crack away, to use a musical phrase, approach that we saw in the Star Kid version just wasn't there. And so it rather exposed the book, particularly in Act 1, for being what it is, which is a series of funny lines or jokes or interactions. And if you do them very, very fast, they really sort of can live. If you do not do them very, very fast, they reveal themselves for what they are, which is iron pyrites, which you'll know as fool's gold.
Mm. I think that's a good observation. And for a show that runs 2 hours and 13 minutes or so, the comic energy was very important to making that duration tolerable. There's a dark side that I'll point out, and I've noticed this happens when you have musicals performed by a regular ensemble, rather than a group that's sort of ad hoc summoned to perform this particular show. And that is, scenes are added to make sure that every member of the ensemble has a moment in the spotlight. I would argue that the scenes here that featured Prince Ahmed were that for this particular show. And I think it's done in the spirit of egalitarianism and fairness and letting people who are not cast in the primary roles have an opportunity to show their comedic talents. And usually when this happens, it's kind of an anchor on the momentum of the story, particularly if these moments happen in the second act, when, as musical audiences, we expect a certain amount of momentum towards the finish line. I saw this a little bit in Timpson, the musical, which we both saw, I think, last year. There were just moments of comedy that were just there for the actors to be funny. And out of context, that's fine, but we have an agenda here. We need to get through this show.
I can see you tapping your watch, Mike.
Exactly. I think that the show did not need to be 2 hours and 15 minutes.
No.
Even with the virtuosic comedic talent on display, I think it could have been heavily trimmed and been just as much fun, if not more.
Oh, yes. I mean, one of the great secrets of comedy is not just pace, but editing. Yes. Less really is more in a comedy, very often anyway. So I'm not going to in any way criticise the actors, because like you, I thought they were superlative. But every sketch, because that's sort of what it was a song followed by a sketch, almost more than a scene, shall we say, just went on a little too long, which, as you say, is a little bit self-indulgent, let's be brutal. Not on the actor's part, but yes, you could easily chop 15 minutes, if not more, out of that piece and make it pacier and better. Agreed.
Another area in craft that I think to which we should apply some praise is the music and lyrics, which is strange we haven't actually mentioned that in great detail. I thought the songwriting was very sophisticated. I had the same opinion when I saw Firebringer, which was another Star Kid show. I don't know if it's the same composer, lyricist team, but the lyrics were very clever. They, I think, almost entirely used perfect rhyme, which is definitely a thumbs up in my book.
Hooray for craft.
The craft was very high throughout this show and deserves a lot of praise.
Well, let's talk about some of those songs. In fact, let's start with the opening line. At the very beginning, the character we'll later identify as Scheherazade comes out as a narrator, and she says, "Once upon a time." Now, of course, Once Upon a Time is a very hackneyed opening to any fairy tale. But when you see a narrator stand in the middle of a stage and say Once Upon a Time and then go into narrate who you're going to see, you immediately think of Into the Woods. So I think, you can tell that the people who'd written it knew there was lots of musical theatre opportunities to have fun. And so I immediately thought, oh, well, they know their Sondheim, even though I wouldn't say it was Sondheimian in any other way. That was plopped in. It has to be deliberate, or so it seems to me. And then I think we'll talk about some of the songs, but I'm going to go straight to one that comes on about 2/3 of the way into the first act, which is called Follow the Golden Rule, which is Jafar's flashbacking manifesto song, if you like, his optimism song about if you do the right thing. And I've written very 1930s pastiche. I'm getting a sense of, funnily enough, what I would say drowsy chaperone pastiche 1930s rather than Gershwin genuine 1930s. It was a very good example of that. It felt like a very good Disney song. It showed Jafar to be up, as a paragon. It's his real sort of starting point, if you like, on his journey, even though it's done in flashback. And then about an hour later, once I'd finished watching the show, I thought, oh, it's also heavily borrowing melodically from You've Got a Friend in Me, from Toy Story. So I'm going to ask you here, Mike, because I suspect you've got a better handle on these kind of things. In terms of the songs, in terms of their music, did you find that it was resonant of other shows by Disney? Did you find it was resonant of other shows in general? Or did you find it wasn't really resonant at all? It was just good original stuff? Because I think it was all very nicely done, but I can't help but feeling it showed its working in one or two cases.
Well, first of all, I want to enforce your liking of the Follow the Golden Rule song, which I thought was the best song in the whole show. Melodically, it was very catchy. And there was a extremely clever lyrical twist when the song was reprised by the bad guys, or some of the bad guys later, and they changed the lyrics in contrast to the very public-spirited young vizier, who is very much a Boy Scout and very much civic-minded, he encounters the old guard, the established corrupt politicians, and they take his motto, Follow the Golden Rule, and they transform it into Follow the Gold and Rule.
Yes.
Which I thought was amazing.
Brilliant,
that was super smart. But the song, even if you ignore the reprise, the song was very catchy, it was very clever, and very appealing. And I think to some extent that's true of a lot of the score here. There is both a desire to reference the style of Disney in general, as you mentioned in passing, and I think there are some quotes from particular Disney songs thrown liberally throughout the score. It's an interesting balance because it is possible to write something that is obviously meant to be a reference to another song, just as it's possible to write a show that is obviously a parody of another show. And in that case, the song ends up being a little hollow. And it sounds like its only value is to say, see, we're kind of doing I Can Show You the World. But it's also possible to write something that refers to a genre in a very general way and still delivers some kind of message that's meaningful. And in that case, I think Follow the Golden Rule was a perfect example. The other songs felt a little more sarcastic, a little more saccharine, a little more tongue-in-cheek, reference to existing tunes, and often less musically memorable, because the idea there was to musically reference a trope or quote something else. The show did, I think, exist on both sides of that dividing line, and was musically more successful when it was trying to do something original that wasn't just a parody of another song.
Yes, so, and fun enough, I think that the score breaks down into what we were identifying earlier as parody musical songs and then sincere songs. And it does appear that the sincere songs were also the more successful. I think Act 2 has got more of the sincere songs, but there's one called If I Believed. And then later on, oddly, the song where he meets his core of Disney villains from other films is actually a sincere song. We think it's going to be an anthem to bad, but it's not. It's an anthem to good and the downtrodden, essentially. So it's funny enough. I've written a number of notes when I was watching that one in particular. I've said very Weimar Republican vile. Well, it had that kind of, cabaret style,
Right.
maybe more Candor and Ebb than vile, but that. And And then, funny enough, there was also a little bit of soliloquy song to the audience in part of that. So there's a lyric where Jafar says, "What remains of a man when that man is dead and gone? Only memories and stories of his deeds will linger on. But if a man's accomplishments aren't in the tale they tell, are the deeds that go unheralded his legacy as well?" First of all, I like that as a lyric. I think it's quite interesting. It sets out the point of the story. If someone else is telling his story and they don't tell it properly, what is his legacy? And as we know from Aladdin, it's a negative one. But also that addressing the audience kind of thing, funnily enough, reminded me of the confession scenes, if you like, from the musical The Mystery of Edwin Drood. So there are some more wide flavours coming in, not just from the Disney world. I was particularly like that song. It was called Twisted, wasn't it? In fact, that was the one called Twisted.
That was the title tune, yeah.
Yeah, because their stories had been twisted, and it had in turn twisted them.
No, I agree. I like that storytelling was a story motive, not character motive, throughout the whole show, in making Scheherazade the romantic interest and having her be an explicit storyteller, and using that as a lyrical anchor for the love songs, and then revisiting that at the end. I also thought that was a very effective device in the story, and worked in favor of the aspect of the show that was sincere. You know, if you imagine an alternate reality where this show was split into two, all right, let's imagine two alternate realities. In one alternate reality, the show is demusicalized or just made into a satire and maybe shortened, and it's just a parody. There's no attempt to create a emotional through line, just done for laughs, which I think would have been very successful for that kind of show. But let's imagine alternate reality number 2, where the more vulgar aspects, the more cynical and mean-spirited aspects were stripped away, and this was turned into something more akin to Wicked, where it was exploring an existing mythology and adding behind the scenes and letting us revisit characters in a new light, but without a purpose of ridicule. I think this would have been a very strong musical. It would have been very different in tone, but it could have been very solid and freed of, you know, the having sex with animals jokes and the slavery jokes and the constant expletives and the let's look at the grim implications of some of Disney's tropes. If you free with that level of pandering to the parody universe audience and turned it into a sincere show, a la Wicked, I think it would have been really strong. And the whole storytelling motive would have served very well to give the whole thing a coherence that even the original movie didn't have.
Oh, yes, I think that's fair. I very much liked Aladdin. I was the right age when it came out, in some senses, the original film. But even at the time, I liked a lot of the score, but I thought it sort of didn't quite gel when you looked at it together. And I haven't gone back to it in many years, which is also quite interesting. And of course, Aladdin in this country, at least in the United Kingdom, is churned out every Christmas as one of our staple pantomimes. So, you know, it's along with Cinderella, Jack and the Beanstalk and Aladdin, Dick Whittington. You know, there's a little sort of canon, if you like. And I've seen a million Aladdins in my time. And they don't generally reflect the film too much. That is a particular take on the Aladdin story, but there are other versions and emphases that you can have. And I would say on the whole, British pantomime doesn't owe too much to Aladdin. So the Aladdin film is not the last word on Aladdin in the United Kingdom by any means. So there will be a cultural difference for us here as well, I suspect. I can't imagine. Well, tell me, how many Aladdins have you seen in your time? Because I know you don't go to British pantomime on the grounds that it isn't available where you are.
Exactly. No, I have a strange fascination with the idea of British pantomime, but I've never had access to it, so I don't have any comment there. But the posters are fascinating.
I'm going to be dragging you to one eventually. You do know that, don't you?
I've steeled myself to that eventuality.
Excellent. So that's, yes, I agree with your analysis, but there are two very different shows coexisting on the stage. And actually, it might be healthier for it if it went off in one direction or the other. I think you and I are obviously, I hope you won't mind me saying, of a generation and appreciation for what might be called the comedy musical, you know, a more traditional piece of musical theatre where we want a little bit of sustenance emotionally all the way through. And there is an audience out there for the fast-paced, sweary parody, which just goes from A to B to C to D, and is very funny in its own right, but doesn't have much underneath it to make it a very nourishing meal if you're looking for that nourishing meal. I should say, if you go online, certainly on the YouTube page, it's actually quite interesting reading the comments. The people who watch it have all left really very positive comments, and I can understand that. There's a real sense of enthusiasm for the piece. I would say, I don't want to be judgmental in any way, but it feels to me like many of those comments are made by younger people. And that is in no way to say they are anything other than perfectly valid. Of course they are. But it's quite interesting to me that I wonder if this is one of those musicals in its current form that is designed to appeal to a younger audience rather than one that's a little bit longer in the tooth, if you'll allow me to slander you in such a terrible way, Mike.
Right. Well, I think it's true that anything that's funny to people in their 20s, no matter where you are in human history, will be mildly tedious to people who are twice that age or older. I think that's yes. Always going to be true. And I guarantee you the people who love this show are going to be put off by something that's going to come out in 20 years. So I don't think it's wrong. I think when you haven't seen as many musicals, the humor, the irreverence, the parody aspect may be fresh. And also, let's not rule out the possibility that some of the people who have seen the show and who are enthusiasts saw it live.
Of course.
And I think whenever you've got a show like this, it's going to be so much funnier live when you see real human beings and you appreciate the comedic talent in a way that you don't fully do when you're watching a YouTube video. So that we have to factor that in as well.
However, there are lots of lovely little flourishes. I keep saying this. Somebody else put this on YouTube, although I had spotted it myself. In history, at least in the history of culture from where she comes, Scheherazade is the teller of the 1001 Tales, Arabian Nights. And I believe most famously translated by Richard Burton, the Victorian explorer and not the 20th century actor. He made it famous, if you like, in the West, in an English translation. And so there's always been a certain fascination for the 1001 Nights. When we see Scheherazade and Jafar sort of meet for the very first time, and they very quickly fall in love with each other, and it's all very charming, she does mention that she has 1,000 stories. And therefore Jafar becomes her 1001st. And that is a rather sweet, rather lovely little moment there. And I like that little thing. It's just a throwaway. Someone else pointed out on YouTube, and I hadn't spotted it overtly, but the moment it was pointed out on YouTube, I thought, oh yes, that's quite right. And we're going into the spoiler here. It becomes apparent that Jafar is probably Jasmine's father in real life. And there's a tiny little moment, it was identified, where she, because she's so vacuous, she can never remember Aladdin's name, so she writes it on her hand. And when she writes it down, she's trying to remember how many L's and D's it's got. It's 1 L and 2 D's, in case you're interested. And she consults Jafar, with whom she's been arguing, and they both get it right. And then they look at it in her hand, and she says, oh, that looks strange. And he goes, yeah, it does. And it's just a little tender moment that you could sort of imagine a father and daughter might have. That's directorial, but it is there in the text. There's little moments like that where actually some kind of good emotional thought has gone into connections and just little moments of glue to make the emotional story work. But there aren't that many, but there are a few. And that's refreshing. You know, that suddenly looked like a real relationship amongst the only, as I said, 2 characters I believe had an opportunity to have a relationship of any worth. Certainly Jasmine's relationship with Aladdin, I'm pleased to say, does not go the way you think it might. She certainly gets the better of him, and he essentially reveals himself to be pretty poor pickings if you're looking for a boyfriend, I would have thought. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that there were lots of little moments if you saw them, even if you didn't overtly see them, as I didn't that one. But when it was pointed out, I thought, yes, well, I had clocked it at the time. I didn't realise quite what it meant, but it had sort of left me pleasantly warmer.
I agree. I liked that moment, and the relationship between Jafar and Jasmine, I felt, was a valid part of Jafar's story. At the same time, we keep running into the same limitations of parody because Jasmine is a horrible, horrible person. And that fact is in the back of our heads, at least it was in the back of my head when watching this. So I had to kind of forget who Jasmine was and just focus on the fact that Jafar lost a daughter and lost his wife at the same time, and that the reconnection to a daughter figure who presumably is his actual daughter was very emotionally meaningful to him.
Now, by contrast, whilst I liked lots of those little directorial points, there was something that grew increasingly irritating to me as it went on, and that was the shoehorning in of Disney film titles or song titles. Now, I appreciate the whole thing is Disney-esque, and you can plop a few in every now and then, and you think, that's clever. I, clever me, have spotted what they've done. But if you do it too much, it becomes self-indulgent. And by the time we got to that darn cat, in which way a tiger was briefly described, I thought to myself, probably enough, or maybe more than enough, too much. So, I like cleverness. In fact, I adore cleverness. I aspire to it, goodness knows. But I find that when things tip over into self-indulging moments, it's alienating to an audience, or I find it alienating. And I know it's a point of threshold. My threshold will be in a different place to somebody else's, which will be in a different place to somebody else's again. You see this quite often when corpsing occurs. Certainly a British audience quite likes one moment, possibly even two, of corpsing, where, I don't need to explain this, but I'm going to, where one or more actor seems to be laughing on stage when they shouldn't be. They've broken character to laugh as the actor rather than as the character. There was none of that in this, by the way, or I didn't spot it if there was. So this is...
I spotted at least one moment of that.
Deliberate corpsing or real corpsing?
One actor who we could see in close-up, because it was filmed that way, was clearly trying to hold back laughter at one point.
Oh, fine, but I thought, yes, sorry, but I'm quite happy with that if it's once or twice and it's sincere. What I have seen on stage, quite often in pantomime, I'm sorry to say, is where a corpse is overdone. You get it 2 or 3 or 4 times at different points in the show, and it becomes incredibly wearing and unprofessional. Whereas if you do it once, I don't know, I think on the whole an audience, certainly my experience of an audience, is quite happy to go along with it. It can be turned into something insincere, either because it's been written in too often or because it's been performed too often, and it can ultimately be alienating. That's quite heavy going for me in terms of what I was actually saying was I just didn't like too many references to Disney cartoons being stuck in. There's nothing terrible about that, but it felt like one idea too far. The Disney versus Pixar thing, and there was a moment about a 2D team being executed, the 2D team being very heavily set up as being the duty and devotion team, but of course it's 2D cinema,
right?
Which at the time was looking like its days were numbered, as we all embraced 3D. Ho ho! Anyone who's been round the clock enough will know that 3D comes and 3D goes. But some of those points just felt a little bit heavy-handed. You can sometimes sense that sometimes the narrative was being sort of shoehorned into a position in order to make the point, when actually if you're having to kink it too much or really force it, then don't put it in, I always think. It's like the ugly sister trying to get her foot into Cinderella's slipper. If we're playing the Disney game, if it doesn't fit, don't put it in.
The show might have been a little too ambitious in the number of themes or analogies they were trying to cram in. And I agree the Disney Pixar comparison was confusing because they didn't have time to follow through and make it more meaningful. Like, Prince Ahmed was not in any way similar to John Lasseter. There wasn't any resemblance to Pixar. They just had a brief dialogue exchange where they tried to describe the merger of those two companies in terms that made sense, sort of, for the story. And it was a little too much.
Yes.
That would have been first on the chopping block if I were the editor.
By chopping block, you mean, I hope, the editing table rather than the execution block?
Right. No one deserves to die for this show. I can say that with great confidence.
Yes, I am also aware that we will sound to anyone who's listened this far really quite negative, but I don't think, well, certainly I don't mean to be negative. I think it's interesting what choices about the direction any narrative is going to take forces you into. I said this at the beginning. biopic musicals, which is a very clumsy term, and I've only just been using it in the last 6 months, are a perfectly legitimate way of writing a musical theatre. I don't mean this one in particular. I'm talking about all occasions where a life is portrayed for a musical. But it does immediately bring a structural problem. Another structural problem, which I've also discussed on Musical Talk in the past, is when you're trying to describe a historical movement. You either do it the Titanic film way, where you invent characters, insert them in, and therefore they become the emotional bridge, which then allows you, hopefully, to illustrate the historical situation or idea that you're illustrating. Or you don't, you're much braver, but then you have to find ways of illustrating that historical movement or position or political view in a way that makes some kind of connection with the audience. It isn't just a lecture. Also very, very difficult to do. Or I've said at the beginning of this, this starts off, certainly Act 1. Well, actually, it is. It's the story of Jafar. So it's got some structural issues in. On top of that, it's a parody musical, which creates other limitations. So it's boxed itself into a number of corners already. It then comes out with this great set of flourishing jokes, dialogues, married to a marvellous set of performances. Really cannot credit the performers well enough because they were so good, every single one of them. The chap playing Jafar, I thought, was really... I mean, it's King Lear, isn't it, of Disney film characters, if you like, this show. He's on almost all the time. He has to play different ages. He has to play different emotional states. He's somebody who's got a journey. And that must be much harder to carry off in a world where all the other characters are grotesque. So he hasn't even got other speech marks, real characters to bounce off. So I thought that was a virtuoso performance. So much to enjoy. Musically, we've spoken about a number of the songs. This has a score where you take some of those songs home in your mind. They do linger. So there's a very great deal to enjoy. But it also just carries its weaknesses with it. And I don't know how easily surmountable they might be in a different interpretation.
I am inclined to agree. I think there's a lot of entertainment value here, and there are definitely limitations. I think that parody has a short half-life, and generally the shorter the better, which is why the perfect instantiation of the concept of parody is represented in the Weird Al song, which will be 3 minutes long. And if you have a longer form parody, you run into the real question of what to do when the joke has been exhausted. And if the answer is, well, let's kind of sidewind into a real story, then it becomes, to my mind, awkward. I know that you got more out of it than I did in this respect, but I think this is one of the dangers of long-form parody.
I think, Mike, we probably need to bring this to some kind of conclusion.
Well, if the final song in the show is called A Story with No End, we should not emulate that and have a podcast with no end. So I feel like we've covered the territory fairly thoroughly here, and this might be a good juncture to draw to a close.
In which case, thank you very much, Mike, for giving me so much of your time to talk about Twisted. As always, you've brought a great many insights to this discussion, which I just hadn't thought myself. So, as always, you've opened my eyes. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, your sentiments are reciprocated, and as always, it's a pleasure to be on the show.
Musical Talk. And there we are. The wonderful Michael Gordon Shapiro there in conversation with me about Twisted, the Untold Story of a Royal Vizier from 2013. And remember, if you want to see that musical, you can, because the people behind it, Star Kid Production, have very kindly released the recording they made from their original 2013 performances in Chicago and placed it on YouTube in its entirety, where at the time of the broadcast of this episode, it can still be found. It's very much worth a watch, and you can see whether you agree with me and Mike. Now, you may remember at the beginning of the conversation that we started last week, we were talking about how viziers aren't that common as characters in musical theatre, and then we immediately remembered there's at least 2 to be found if you don't include the original vizier in Aladdin from 1992 from the Disney Corporation. We identified Kismet as a show where a vizier has a very significant character. And I also remembered The Rose of Persia, which is a 2-act comic opera by Arthur Sullivan and Basil Hood. And it counts as Arthur Sullivan's last completed comic opera because although he went on to collaborate once more with Basil Hood, he died halfway through the creative process. So the Rose of Persia is, in many ways, Arthur Sullivan's last gift to the world, at least in the form of operetta. And it comes 4 years after the last Gilbert and Sullivan. So, as I spent a few minutes at the end of last week's episode talking about Kismet, featuring a vizier, I thought now would be a good time to do the same thing for the Rose of Persia. And, unbelievably, in my researches I found a link between the two shows. And that's Percy Anderson, who designed the costumes both for the Rose of Persia in 1899, but also the original non-musical stage version of Kismet from 1911 by Edward Knobloch. It's a small world, smaller still if you consider that the market for designing costumes for viziers appears to have been entirely sewn up for a generation by Percy Anderson. But I digress. Let's get back to the Rose of Persia. Well, as I said, the last Gilbert and Sullivan was The Grand Duke, and that was produced by Richard D'Oyly-Carte for the Savoy Theatre in 1895. It wasn't a huge success at the time and closed relatively quickly for a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. After that, D'Oyly-Carte was keen to try and find other people to fill the gap creatively and, of course, financially, and so he paired Sullivan up with a whole bunch of other librettists. But it wasn't until he started working with Basil Hood, who, whilst not as good as Gilbert, was very much in the Gilbert tradition, including clever wordplay and patter, that any kind of semblance of success was again found. And the show that did that was The Rose of Persia. And whilst it's described as a comic opera, and very much in the Gilbert and Sullivan tradition, it's also leaning into the beginnings of musical comedy, the slightly freer structure that followed on and had already started to make a success both on Broadway and in London's West End. And in London, that was after a watershed show called Dorothy. Now, The Rose of Persia has a subtitle called The Storyteller and the Slave. And the show's plot is described online as having a topsy-turvy plot, mistaken identities, the constant threat of execution, an overbearing wife, a fearsome monarch who is fond of practical joking, and significant comic wordplay. And if you know anything about W.S. Gilbert, you'll know that those are things that he was particularly adept at either doing or writing about. They were some of his stock bits and pieces for his shows. So it's no surprise then that Sullivan was suddenly in his element. And the show was a relative success. It opened on the 29th of November 1899 and closed on the 28th of June 1900. Remember, this is at exactly the same time that Florodora, which was not a comic opera and was a piece of musical comedy, i.e. it had made that transition, was also playing in London, and, it has to be said, more successfully. But The Rose of Persia still ran for 211 performances, and then toured in America and across the English-speaking world. And it was still being revived in Britain regularly until the 1950s, as was Florodora, incidentally. But since then, performances have been very, very much fewer, although, as always, quality will out, and those late Sullivan shows are starting to be revived again. And I think it's telling that all 4 recordings made of The Rose of Persia were made either in the very late 20th century or in the 21st century. And that clearly reflects the more academic interest that's taking place in relation to the late and separate works of both Gilbert and Sullivan. And by contrast, it's interesting to note, I think, that the very first recording of The Rose of Persia was an amateur one from 1963, which is only 64 years after the recording of the score of its contemporary Florodora, which was recorded unbelievably in 1899 and kicked off the industry of original cast recordings. How would we live without them today? Now, in case you've forgotten why I'm talking about this particular piece of slightly obscure musical theatre stroke comic opera, it's because one of the significant characters is a vizier. And my favourite song from the entire musical is called I'm the Sultan's Vigilant Vizier. And it's a quartet led by the Sultan with his vizier, his physician and his executioner, and they're all dressed up as whirling dervishes so that they are not recognised when they tour the streets of the Sultan's domain. And it's the vizier who opens the song. His first words are, I'm the Sultan's vigilant vizier who lets the Sultan know the coast is clear when he, the Sultan, that's in brackets, takes a private stroll, assuming such an assuming role as dervish. And then the next verse is by the physician. I, the Sultan's chief physician, lug the Sultan's private chest of dose and drug and follow his, brackets, the Sultan's, close brackets, Grand Vizier, who lets the Sultan know the coast is clear, when he, the Sultan, takes a private stroll, assuming such an assuming role as dervish. And then the next verse builds on that. It's a very complicated, tricksy lyric. The executioner then sings, I, the Sultan's executioner, come just behind His Majesty of Persia's chief physician who, brackets for latter, close brackets, lugs his, brackets, that's the Sultan's, brackets, private chest of drugs, and follows his, brackets, the Sultan's, close brackets, Grand Vizier, who lets the Sultan know the coast is clear when he, brackets, the Sultan, close brackets, takes a private stroll, assuming such an assuming role as dervish. And so it goes on when the Sultan sings the next verse. I won't carry on, but it is my favourite song from the Rose of Persia. And if you're ever interested, do give it a whirl. It's worth exploring, particularly if you enjoy the Savoy operas. Which, of course, it is. It's just not a Gilbert and Sullivan Savoy opera. But it was an opera written for the Savoy. Well, I think that finishes our investigation both of Twisted and also of viziers in musical theatre, which turns out to have been a most unexpected rabbit hole for us all to have fallen down. But I think it's time to scramble back up to the surface, look into the sunlight and say, thank goodness I don't have to listen to Thos for much longer, because he's clearly about to finish the episode. And what a wise and perspicacious person you are, because you're quite right. So I'm going to do it. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Mike Shapiro and Thos Ribbits and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos. Let me see. Yeah, absolutely. By the way, I will say I did like the fact there was the angry bookseller in the very opening scene, who is so deliberately determined to be upset by Jafar's appearance, who's returning a book to him, that he sneers at him because he can read, whereas he, the bookseller, is illiterate. The idea of an illiterate bookseller amused me no end, I must say.
I agree that there was. Again, viewed as part of the parody universe, I thought the beginning was very successful and very funny.
And really set up, by the way, a reference back to Gilbert and Sullivan, which is that Jafar, who is the voice of reason in an otherwise mad world, is essentially Dick Deadeye from HMS Pinafore. Dick Deadeye comes along. His first thing is to agree with more or less his shipmates' concerns about whether or not a mere shipmate can marry the daughter of a captain. And so he's agreeing with them, and they all turn on him as a kind of sort of bolshy. And then everything else he says later on is always the logical position. You know, it's the one that's real and reflects the actual social status quo. And they all treat him like he's, he's there to speak fluent treason. Anyway, that's a sideline. And finally, when is a door not a door?
I don't know.
When it's Jafar. I'm not including that. Do you know the joke? When is a door not a door?
When it's a jar.
Yes.
Oh, is the when it's a jar? Yeah, I see.
It is. The pain in your voice as you. Yes, thank you. I won't be putting that in. That was just my own pleasure.
I think we have a rich body of material for the blooper section of this episode. It could almost be its own episode.